Let's see. Um... Hello everyone! Hello, how are we all doing? Oh, hang on. That's dropped one. Yeah, that's the correct one. Hello everyone. Now, where is some drink? I have some liquid. Oh, that's good. I have liquid. Hello, Night Sick 81. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Frank Bowell. Hello, Peter Dawson. Hello, Steve Clarke. Hello, Menace6040. Hello, Runon. Hello, Blackman Maximus. Hello, Calvin Esberg. Hello, Mike Cooch. Hello, Brian Newman. Hello, Steve Richards. Hello, Daniel Politics. Hello, DG40. Hello, Just Vonk. Hello, Cody85. Hello, Stafford. And hello, Steve Clarke. And hello, Steve Richards. I think I said that, but never know. Right then. Ooh. As we are approaching. Hello everyone. How are you all doing today? Now, of course, it's not today I'll be wearing this one. It's tomorrow for brew ships. But you know, I thought I'd give you a bit of a taster. I didn't miss you, did I, Leslie? I apologise. So, the turkey hat. It's about the right time for the UK. It's also a bit of a month too late, but it is, you know, it's about the right time for the UK. Hello everyone, how are you all doing? I'm gonna... Also, this is just a tad. Oh. Hello. That is looking very disorganised. It's been a fun day. Right. So today's topic. Frank Whittle is given consistent funding by Britain to develop jet engines from 1928. Now, if you've been following the chat, you'll know that that 9601 was already given his view, which is axial flow is the right way to go. Things need to be transitioned and infrastructure upgrades, etc. And that's all true. But the thing is, if we look at that all happens anyway with what's going on at the time. So that all happens. And all of that actually happens during wartime, which shows the value of jet engines, that even in wartime, when the budgets are really tight, and getting funding for anything is anything novel or different is frigging impossible almost. So it shows what was done in value, but potentially what could be done there under peacetime conditions. Happy birthday to Mr. Richards. So, this was proposed by Blackman Maximus, and his thing was, original question was a Whittle Early. Frank Whittle is given consistent funding by the British government to develop jet engines from 1928. My Cooch, that is an interesting question. If we have early jet engines, what don't we get? We'll be getting into some of that. First of all, shameless book plug. Perfect Christmas present. So let's start off with how do we change history, because that's the first thing to look into. And that's actually easier than you might necessarily think to begin with, because it all comes down to someone who I can't actually find a decent picture of. Excuse me while I just go blow my nose out the door. Don't know why it suddenly decided to become blocked. Gunk. Right. Oh, what's next? What is next week? Take some pills quickly. Now, that's cool from now on. Now, Arnold Gifford is the only other person, other than the pictured Whittle, who's been working on publishing on jet engines as applies to aircraft. And it's he who in 1929 the Air Ministry go to and go, give us your evaluate Whittle's thesis. Should we be investing in this? Is this something we should be funding? Now, Arnold is a very good engineer. Alan Arnold Griffin is a very good engineer. However, like a lot of very good engineers and scientists, I sometimes have a small issue when the things are approaching a problem they care passionately about. Someone's trying something from a different direction. Now, in the case of Whittle and Whittle's thesis, Griffith believed the idea to be impractical. He believed it was impractical because of the size of the condenser, and he felt this was a problem with fitting to the aircraft. And he also managed to find a minor error in calculation, and it really is a minor error in calculation, when you look at the overall thesis. If in the overall thesis and all the calculations you can find one mistake in the entire thing, and it's not even a massive error, it's interesting. But recommended so strongly against it, of course, the Air Ministry turns it down. This is 1929. And the question is 1928. Now, the thing is, Griffith wasn't the only person working on jet engines, or what we would consider under the bracket of jet engine development to this day. The Royal Navy's working at what they termed an efficient turbine project, and that's broadly speaking me bringing together multiple names because it changes its title quite a lot. So broadly speaking, it's an efficient turbine project. And the idea was, could you have a turbine powering a propeller shaft which doesn't need to use a boiler? Because think about this, if you can eliminate boilers, If you can eliminate the need for steam boilers from your ship, think of the weight you can save. Think of how much weight, how much space you can save if you eliminate the need for boilers and all the water needs for those boilers to operate. How much space you get for fuel, how much you get in terms of other things. You know, a power to weight ratio goes very much up, because when we consider the power to ratio of turbines, as in steam turbines, you have to also consider the weight of the boilers, the weight of the fuel, the weight of the water to get it. Whereas for what ends up being called a gas turbine, it's an adaptation of a jet engine in many regards and jet turbine principles. Well, you don't need those things. General Thatcher, what's a naval brigade doing at Battle of Manjuba? Basically, often the Navy was the nearest on-call large group of personnel, so if they needed to grow their numbers quickly and they wanted some heavy weapons, they would ask local ships to send off a section of their crew, and they'd be formed into a naval brigade. Basically, they were nearest closest supply of personnel, and considering Royal Marines would be included in that naval brigade as well, you know. My coach, no steam boilers equals no steam catapults, so carriers will sting them. They might do, but there again, we've got a good example. We've got the Charles de Gaulle, which goes around, which does actually have its own steam boiler set, as well as its own its own turbine set. Eliminated boilers, turbo-electric drives become more efficient. Again, you can go for a diesel turbine system and have it all electric powered. There are options. So, we have two potential scenarios. Whittle goes to the Admiralty, as well as the Air Ministry, or Whittle goes to the Air Ministry and Griffith supports him. Now, honestly, I don't think the easiest thing to change is Griffith, historically. Mainly because Griffith... The thing is, the interplay of his ideas with Whittle's are what lead to the development of the jet engine and the refinement of systems as quickly and as well as they are refined in the UK. And therefore, if you change Griffith, you change all of that debate, all of that development. And I don't think that's necessarily good for the process of development. I think that would actually cause trouble, because I think the debate and discussions often the sparking off between the two of them in terms of their debates and their methodologies, I think that is one of the things which pushes forward development in the UK. The condenser for a jet engine. It was the condenser for a jet engine. Both Griffith and Whittle are working on jet engines for aircraft. If you're dealing with what you're designing for a ship, a gas turbine, remember, jet engines... and it's going to sound strange. The jet engine process develops is how you end up with a gas turbine for warships and for power stations. But the jet, it's not put in that form onto an aircraft. It's the jet engine form, which is slightly different. So it's sort of, how do I put this? Very close, but also divergent lines of development. So, scenario is either Griffith supports him. I said that's not going to happen. Not really good for him. Or he goes to the Air Ministry as well, to the Admiralty as well. I think if he uses his friends in the Fleet Air Arm and goes to the Admiralty, then the worst that happens is he gets turned down. for a few years until Henderson gets in there, in which case Henderson would probably push it on. But there's something rather interesting about the Third Sea Lord at this time. You see, the previous Third Sea Lord was Sir Charles Forbes to Henderson. He was Third Sea Lord from roughly 1932 to 1933. Predecessor to him was Sir Roger Backhouse. And Backhouse is one of the most interesting officers in the Royal Navy. And he is the major architect of the Singapore strategy. He's the major architect of a lot of the strategies behind the Royal Navy. And along with Henderson, is probably one of the most powerful voices in the Royal Navy. And he is actually First Sea Lord, 1938 to 39, when he dies. And then he's succeeded by Sir Dudley Pound. Both Backhouse and Henderson die very quickly. Now, he'd been preceded in both his posts as Third Sea Lord and as First Sea Lord by Chatfield. But he was a very, very good officer. He'd also been First and Principal Naval Aide-de-Camp to the Monarch from 1938 to 1939. So in this period, we would have this officer. An officer who is absolutely obsessed with preparing the Royal Navy for any coming war and for navigating the best out of treaties. I have no doubts that if this idea crosses his desk, considering what the projects they've already got going on in the Navy at this time, trying to push for something like this, I have a feeling the Admiralty would want to get involved. And this is the point. I don't see a scenario where the Admiralty choose to get involved and the Air Ministry don't get involved. I'm going to put it in as a sort of little poll in here, but you know, would the Air Ministry allow the Admiralty to go alone? So, there should now be a question in there, in the poll. And that's, you know, for you all to think about. My view is I don't think there's any scenario where the Air Ministry lets the Admiralty pursue something like this alone, especially as it's being come up with by an RAF officer. I just don't think they do. Modern name for it is a compressor. Yeah. So no, another one of those mysterious deaths. I know the Royal Navy lost so many very senior, very capable officers, and he died of a brain tumour in July 1939. Roger Backhouse did. The amount of officers who die from brain tumours, various other forms of cancer. If you consider Dudley Pound, who's the First Sea Lord after him, of course, also gets a brain tumour. So you've had two First Sea Lords go in quick succession with the same very rare illness in so many regards. Yeah, it's interesting. Pretty much. Wonder how the votes are doing. There have been 24 votes so far, and 8% are saying yes, the Air Ministry would allow the Admiralty to go alone, and 92% are saying no. Right, I'm going to end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's wait for the hand to appear up. Right, 92% no, 7% yes. On would the Admiralty allow the Admiralty to go alone? Poll complete, 25 votes. Yeah, so my theory is pretty much, as said, it goes with that. The idea, it's a case of I don't think the Air Ministry would allow the Admiralty to go solo on this. I know I keep calling it condenser and compressor. That's because today I've been reading a lot of various history things and various papers to make sure I'm prepped for this. And Griffith and Whittle both have a wandering affiliation with those words. So anyway, my only conclusion is that the Royal Navy has used some highly... The thing is, though, if you look at the general percentage of officers dying and deaths, things like the Earl of Cork and Orrery, etc., and Chatfield lived for ages. So, you know, it seems to be very specific officers get ill. I'm not sure. That's YouTube. YouTube run the polling software. I just set it up. So what's the new timeline? Now this is more interesting to work with, okay? It really is interesting to work with in terms of the timeline because it's going to be different than it was historically. Because whilst historically it takes 2 war years to get the engines working, the first flight of the Gloucester E-2839 was the 15th of May 1941. That was 11 years of refinement and development by the Jet Power Company. Mostly without much funding, if any funding. So therefore we have to have an argument of what is a realistic timetable. What is a realistic timetable? Well, if we look at it without the funding issues in the mid-late 1930s, stalling jet power and the company, and the early issues of securing testing, plus the Air Ministry actually supporting things, 5 years to get to flying to a flying aircraft would not seem impossible to me. So, I'm not saying it's the 2 years that historically it does go in wartime, because they don't have those years of actual testing, and though they have all sorts of issues in those intervening 11 years. But if they actually have funding, support, and all that positive energy, then I think they could have an aircraft airborne, something equivalent to this, within 5 years. I think 1933-4 would be the obvious timeline to go to. Now, sorry, I thought like something was going to start dribbling down, so I wanted to grow it first. Now, if we consider that historically the first vessel to have a gas turbine of sorts, as a marinized development leads to, was about 1947. Historically, 6 years of mostly wartime, non-prioritised development, and it is fair to point out the first things it goes into is motor torpedo boats, and the first thing they're sort of testing and putting in there is, you know, they are thinking about is motor torpedo boats, but they quickly do, from motor torpedo boats, go up to other things. It's actually slower, but if you consider that it's, but post World War II, the pace of construction is a lot slower, the availability of ships to construct and adapt with it is much slower, and the funding you can get to adapt with it is much slower and very different than it is in the 1930s. So that's all got to be a factor. So again, if the Admiralty get involved from the beginning, and I would consider Henderson's approach to things, and Blackhouse's and Forbes, who are will be 3 Third Sea Lords in charge of it, I would say Backhouse would be sitting on top of them going, Acceleratum, Acceleratum, I want this as quickly as possible. Because for him, that would be his ace in the hole for the 1930 London Naval Treaty. If he can, then anything, he agrees to the things, but he's got the best power to weight ratio coming up of any engine because he gets to eliminate boilers. So you see, if he can eliminate if he's the only navy in the world which can eliminate boilers from his cost of construction, his tonnage limit cost of construction, then frankly agreeing to the tonnage limitations is great for the Royal Navy. Because they don't need to worry about water in design, so they don't need to protect that or cover that space, and they don't need boilers. Okay. Now, so I would say 1934 to 5 for the first motor torpedo boat. I'm going with roughly 6 years. With testing, that comes interesting because with testing on the motor torpedo boat, if they're quick, then what is the very next design that they are working on that they can fit that into? It's going to be the Trevor class destroyers. Because you think when they're ordered in 1936, if you've been testing something for about a year to 18 months, that's when you can make the order. And King George V class and Illustrious class are all ordered in 1937. So think about that. We could be talking about an Illustrious class, which are ordered a couple of years, well, 4 years, 3-4 years after the first jet aircraft has flown. So there might be some factors going into. I'm not sure if I'd expect to see a redesigned flight deck immediately, i.e. the angled flight deck and all those things. That's something which comes about with operational experience. It's one of those things when we talk about the angled flight deck, people often go, well, you know, that comes in. They'd actually been flying aircraft off carriers, jet aircraft off carriers and onto carriers for a few years by the point at which they get it. So again, I'm not sure if it's something I expect for the Illustrious class to be built with. But it might come in as a wartime conversion edition, which would be really interesting. And the King George V class, well, if you're not having to put those boilers, and if we think about the King George V's, they have a lot of boilers in there. They have 8 capital ship grade Admiralty free drum boilers. You get rid of those, that's a lot of weight saved. A lot of weight saved, and a lot of space saved. And that could be really interesting for a King George V class battleship. You know, the whole thing of having to have that twin turret might not come up. It might be 3 quadrupled 14-inch guns. They might even be faster because they could change the hull shape a bit. And as people are already pointing out, and have pointed out several times already, but we haven't got onto aircraft carrier design yet, because that's going to be kind of a complicated thing, steam for catapults is rather useful. Now, actually the Germans don't have... well, the German jet aircraft is often talked about, but... The first jet aircraft was the Heinkel HE-178, which is flown in roughly 1939. But the thing is, it was one of those interesting issues. It then takes them years to get the 262 into service, etc., because of the issues of their own development and access to materials, and key materials like chromium, etc. And the reality, I would say, with the German scenario, is that the British could well beat the Germans into that if they've got the consistent funding. Because Germany, look at the issues Germany's going through at this point. They haven't got consistent funding. They've got all sorts of different political issues going on. So yeah, the Royal Navy getting into it in 1928, there's a big difference going on there. John Shea, we've done discussions on the King George V class before. The reason they're on 14-inch guns is because of Chatfield and the politicians thinking it's a great idea. Not because anyone else wanted it. I think Henderson probably would have gone with the 15-inch guns and possibly would have gone 9 15-inch guns. But the fact is, you're not changing that at this point. You know, there's no weight advantage. There's no, you know, there's not. Let's put it this way: there's nothing else which is going to change that factor. I'm not, you know, whenever I do these alternate histories and we examine them, it's always a case of looking at it from the point of view and perspective of keep the changes as minimal as possible, so you can work out through what happens. And to change the King George V to 15-inch guns requires I either change the treaties and the intent of the 1937 London Naval Treaty, which means I have to change a lot of countries, or I have to change Chatfield and the government of the UK. And that's a lot of changes. There's still probably going to be the gearing for turbines. Still probably going to be gearing. I think probably direct drive is the way they go initially, at least. I'm not sure. They might go with electric. They might go turbo electric because of the options, but I don't think that's going to be something they're going to consider in the first generation. Now, as for the water for armour sheet, well, that was used on Nelson and Rodney. That wasn't the case on the King George V's. They were using other things as cheating on the King George V's. Or rather, within the letter rather than the spirit of the rules. Andrew Cox, no coincidence that all the Allied companies that started building jets later in the war were those who built high-performance air-pissed engines and had the high-performance materials available. Developing these materials took a lot of work in late 20s and 30s. Potentially you end up with an engine with insufficient life for service. Yes and no. You see, one of the interesting things is when we're talking about the development in the 20s and 30s of those materials, a lot of those materials development are driven by the engines you're procuring. And again, there is another reason why linking in the Admiralty makes a bit of sense here. Because the Admiralty has far more experience in managing metallurgical development than the Air Ministry. And furthermore, the Admiralty has access to some very, very high caliber metallurgists and turbine system generators. So once you're into jet engines, you are starting to get into already an area of Admiralty knowledge. I would say, therefore, you have a solid chance. A solid chance. Now, I think one of the interesting things you might get is that means you might get companies like Parsons involved. You might even get Browns, as well as Rolls-Royce and Napier. I think, honestly, you're looking at maybe even Bristol as well. You would get far more involvement, a far wider field of engineering involvement, because, again, those companies would have the time and the ability in peacetime to more flexibly build and develop the industrial capacity they need. One of the problems you have in the later 30s in terms of that is the funding for these programs. Whereas in the late 20s, early 30s, if you've got the funding in place, which I think such a scenario would have, I think you could deal with it. I also think the difference of those companies involved would be interesting. I think if you've got someone, we can all think about it, but think of the difference between Parsons and Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, one of the big reasons why Packard is so important to them is really Rolls-Royce engines are still being almost built individually. Whereas if you look at Parsons, they've industrialized their construction of engines. Parsons are a very, very standardizing engineering firm that do produce standardized turbines. And there's something really interesting if you go with the history of getting the Admiralty program and fusing it in at this stage with the Air Force program and the two working together. I don't think they're going to solve all the problems magically. That's the point I'm going to make. But this is why I've given it the time I think it would have, because of those different combinations of those groups coming in together. Andrew Cox, a lot of the best Rolls-Royce materials were based on work done for the Schneider aircraft. Yeah, it was Supermarine. I'm not sure if they'd make that much of a difference away. I think they could get 3 of the quadruples. Again, if you're going for 4 triples, you're changing the turret structure again. I can understand why you want to, but you're getting to an extent distracted from the topic we're discussing. You're going down the route of the what ifs for King George V class. And the thing is, they very quickly get into those designs because they're going with a quadruple turret, because that's considered the efficient weightage, and especially once you're going for a 14-inch gun, it's considered the efficient scenario. They would have liked 3 quadruple turrets. It was displacement which forced them to go with 2 quadruples and a twin. If they've got the displacement space, they will probably go with the 3 quadruples. And as I said, I'm thinking gas turbine gears. Andrew Cox, how would that expanded base align with Whittle's unwillingness to work with large companies for fear of losing control? To be honest, it wasn't so much a fear of losing control, it was the fact that, honestly, you're dealing with him at a different time. It's 10 years earlier, when he hasn't been beaten up so much by large companies and by the Air Ministry. And one of the things you have to consider that the Air Ministry does is they gut his company, give all his ideas to other companies to go and develop to go and build the engines, and then, well, they end up nationalising the company for £135,000 and wonder why all its best engineers pretty much up and leave. It's a really badly managed scenario. Really badly managed scenario. So, out of a naval gas turbine, as I said, the exotic materials constraint. Where's the exotic materials constraint coming from? Let me be practical to you, okay? In wartime, the constraints there are very big ceilings because you're having to import everything and you're under the threat and you have to escort everything, and so you have timelines and all those things. In peacetime, if you want more materials, how do you get it? you order more. And maybe it comes on a British ship, maybe it comes on an American ship, maybe it comes on... It doesn't matter so much, and it's going to come in. It's not going to get intercepted on the way. So yes, you have some issues. But these are issues which can be solved far more easily at this point, because you're not providing a lot of people for the Army and the Air Force. You're not... If we consider this period, we're talking about 1928 to 1935. So we're talking about a period when there isn't a mass expansion of the armed forces going on, where there is a fair large chunk of unemployment going on, where if you're investing in these things, you're going to be creating employment, where if you're going to push it forward, you're going to have support, and where you have the personnel pool in terms of the population to draw on the knowledge needed to do the work. They're not off doing other things. This is one of the problems you have to compare with in wartime. Because people think in wartime, you're able to mobilize far more efficiently. Actually, the reverse is true. In wartime, you have a lot of a massive growth in demand for those people's attention, sort of the smart scientists and engineers you have, and you can't afford to focus them. You can't, you have to spread them out where they need to go all over places. But in peacetime, you lose a lot of those pressures. A lot of the things which require their attention, so immediate upgrade, immediate work, you can schedule it in. It's not immediate, it's scheduled. I'm also... Don't take us the wrong way again, is look at the engines which are fitted, turbines, etc. The gas turbine systems which are fitted to modern ships, and are fitted even quite quickly to ships. The thing is, ships don't burn the same fuel as aircraft do. No. John can't. No, it's... I find it strange that various shops all over the world can suddenly make working gas turbine engines. Well, that's the interesting thing. It's not really new steels. They have very high quality steels. You have to remember, this is a period where there's a lot of metallurgical development going on in steels, and in producing steels which can withstand very high temperature because of the very large gun barrels works going on. So this is another thing of companies getting involved. If you get Parsons involved, if you get Browns involved, possibly Vickers involved with their metallurgical capabilities, that's going to be a very different scenario. So this is one of the things I'm adding into this mix, because one of the things you have to consider with jet engine development as it happened historically in the UK was very much managed, and once it was got the Air Ministry decided they actually were going to go into it in 1939, they very much managed it through the aero engineering companies. And to an extent, the aero engineering companies have a lot less experience in certain areas than the big marine engineering companies. Now, the marine engineering companies have less experience than the aero engineering companies in other areas. So please note, I'm not saying one is better than the other or anything like that. I don't want to have a whole load of comments of people saying, oh, you just like the naval engineers and da-da-da-da-da. No. It's they have differing experiences, different mixes. You combine those two together, you get a very different scenario. You get a lot of information that can be put together very quickly. And that's historically actually what does happen, but it takes a time for them to go and start looking and going, oh, they have the material for us there. And the marine engineering company's going, you want this stuff? Oh, this is fairly standard stuff. We've been using this for high pressure steam engines, etc. for a while. I think you can get Stafford. You can get too wrapped up in very tight specifics. I think you're looking for a lot of specific detail. And I think the trouble is you can't really produce that. You can, when I say specific detail, I mean in terms of what they're working up to when it comes to the engines. So it might be that normally a destroyer might have two gas turbines. It might have two steam turbines. Let's say. Let's just go with that. Let's say the normal destroyer would have two steam turbines and three boilers. Well, a destroyer which is powering it's got a gearbox extra, it might end up with four gas turbines of the time developed. That might be how they power it. They put in four gas turbines, two for each shaft, and going through a joint gearbox. There are things there, but if you consider that this turboprop destroyer requires 44,000 shaft horsepower, four gas turbines, each generating 11,000 shaft horsepower, is not a massive is not a major issue to get to. You'd probably be talking about 15,000 shaft horsepower, in which case, again, you might still go with four, but that means you've now got 60,000 shaft horsepower, 30,000 for each shaft. You could well be talking about a 40-knot destroyer for still less weight. Right. If they're jet plane ready in time for the Paris Air Show in 1956, it could be a good move for prestige and morale. It could be. There could be early turboprops. One of the interesting things when we start talking about aircraft development a bit is that I think it's more likely you have turboprops for naval aircraft necessarily than pure jet aircraft to begin with. Andrew Cox, a lot of the early blade materials were cobalt-based or high cobalt materials. I'm not sure if you would class them as steels. They later went for nickel for high temperatures. Yeah, you're talking... Well, let's be honest. You're talking... the reason I usually use the phrase of metallurgy. You are... How do I put this? Pardon me. Alloys. You know, that's sort of the scenario you're looking at. And you're looking at a lot of very advanced metallurgical science. And again, the other advantage of getting the marine engineering firms involved in this is they tend to have bigger plant facilities than the aero engineering firms. Turboprops are definitely underappreciated. Now, what's the big change? Well, the big change I've already discussed a bit is power to weight ratio. The big incentive for the Royal Navy in really pushing down this road and really funding it heavily, and the marine engineering firms probably taking something of a lead because it's quicker to get it into. One of the big problems with Whittle's designs, and especially his earlier designs, is scaling it down to aircraft sized. But ship size is different than aircraft size. Let's be honest, you can afford to have it bigger on a ship. So what you'd be looking at, and what you probably looking at the Royal Navy be looking at, is how much does this save? Again, if we consider the King George V, they have 110,000 shaft horsepower they require to move. Well, as we just talked about with the tribals, that's, I would myself reckon you would have roughly for 11 to 15,000 shaft horsepower turbines driving two shafts, and that's going to give you roughly 60,000 shaft horsepower. Again, if you can change 4 geared steam turbines and 8 boilers for 8 jet engines, even if they're only providing 15,000 shaft horsepower each. 8 gas turbines providing 15,000 shaft horsepower each. And you've got 2 of those hooked up by gearing to each engine. That changes things. Now let's think what also changes with this. Think about the size of an engineering space for boilers and engine rooms, turbine rooms, etc., if you're shrinking it down. If you've just got those turbines, those gas turbines. Think about how much that shrinks down the space requirements in the hull. Think about how it affects the crew requirements in the hull. Think about how it affects, again, survivability in the hull. Because if that space, you can compartmentalize between them far more. Your engine, the compartments, the engine spaces, the things that drive, the gearing and the turbines, which connect into the shaft. That's far, far easier. And if you could almost do an individual, put each turbine in its own room if you wanted to, in its own space. And have them linked to the gearing, which connects into the shaft. So you'd have a gearing and shaft room, and you'd have the shafts from turbines running into that gearing. And so you could have 8 individual spaces. Now, again, this is going to have an impact on stability in terms of weight. Now, before anyone gets too worried about this, there are things you can do. You can put more ammo down. You can store more ammo, stuff like down there. You can also put concrete down there as a way to have extra weight in the hull. There are options for how you can manage it. You might need to use thicker steel for the hull plating. That is also a way that they sometimes manage these things. So, again, it's not going to be. It's none of this is none of these are going to be insolvable problems. They're going to be nice problems to have. Now, this is the whole point of the issues. The reality of the system becomes that you are entering this in early enough that you could have had a couple of generations of ships go through the Royal Navy. And maybe even beyond your second generation of jet aircraft in service by the time of World War II. If we think about the pace of aircraft change and evolution development, the Royal Navy has a habit of changing its aircraft every 3 years in this period. The Air Ministry is not much different. So in which case, you might have a generation go through of aircraft. You might not, might have turboprops, there's all sorts of options of what comes through. Andrew Cotton, when I was attending university, many of my professors worked in geared gas turbines. Materials in turbines are exotic and trade secrets. The planes are exotic. They are really, really good, and especially once you get to the very high-powered ones. But it's, again, there's a reason I'm sticking to. I'm not presuming they're jumping up to massively powerful ones straight off. I'm not thinking they're going to suddenly scale up really, really quickly. But if we look at the technology of the earlier ones, which are, well, could probably provide the equivalent of enough to, as said, I keep saying 11 to 15,000 shaft horsepower. I'm keeping it relatively low for the requirement. They are within the metallurgical limits, I would say, of the mid 1930s. Looking at the technologies and the materials that they require, so I would say they're capable to be produced in this period. Again, one of the things you have is that once you start developing on, you can push forward. So we're not quite sure how far it could really get if it starts developing this much earlier, and if they're pushing in. Especially the more big companies you have involved, and the more competition there is between those companies, who knows what could happen if Parsons if Parsons really do think that gas turbines are the coming thing for turbine systems and for engines, the amount of research and development funds they would be prepared to pour into it could be obscene. Because they're the ones who are pushing all sorts of things in the UK. And they can really get money. And that's an interesting thing, again, because if you link Parsons, considering Parsons' history, up with Jet Power Company, in many ways the Jet Power Company are modelled on the idea of Parsons, in that they were disruptors breaking into the market and setting themselves up. In many ways, Parsons, therefore, is almost a natural fit for them to work with, as they're still very much that company which Algernon and Parsons had set up. And the things get... Parsons, again, if you consider their turbine manufacture, that was some really high-grade stuff. They've been pushing the breaking edge of steam turbines for quite a while. You're not constructing the Concorde engine in the 1930s. You're not constructing... You're not getting to that level that quickly, because you don't historically get that level that quickly. It takes a good 10, 15, 20 years. But you are doing this prior to the interference of World War II, so you don't have that addition on. But also you are doing it with the funding realities of the prior to 1930s. Now, the interesting thing is if you're combining this development of radar. So Maximus, one problem with jet aircraft is as they go faster, the issue of intercepting becomes harder. Aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and C-100 Canuck had radar gun sights to help them. All true. So radar's going to be having to be pushed forward as well a bit, but I honestly don't think... This is going to sound strange, but I think when it comes to aircraft, I'll be talking about those in a bit. My view is that you would have the first generation of aircraft in service about 1937, 36, 37, coming into actual regular service. And I think you would be talking about the aircraft you'd be looking at in World War II, realistically, would be actually aiming for service in 1940. Andrew Cox, the thing with a gas turbine is it can make almost any engine, any power of any size. A big engine of high core flow will be lower temperature, heavy and less efficient. True. The key is getting crossover point. The gas turbine gives you the power with the weight saving with the available metallurgy. Yep. No, I don't think this saves. I don't think this saves Tiger. I think the Royal Navy starts off again. It's gonna sound strange, but there's a reason I picked motor torpedo boats and then destroyers to start it off. Because that's historically what the Royal Navy did. So naval differences. Well, there's a lot of those ships which would be unaffected by the changes. I don't think someone's going to rip open Nelson and Rodney and install jet engines or gas turbines, whatever we want to, calling those things. And I don't think Ark Royal suddenly gets built as a angled flight deck aircraft carrier, because again, that takes actually years of service to actually realise the need for it. It's one of the things that comes about with years of service. And Ark Royal is already being well built and well under construction in this timeline, so I don't think she even gets gas turbines herself. Interesting enough, there are ships there which are going to be affected. There are ships which are going to be affected. As Dan Freeman was pointing out, Dreadnought was not the first turbine powered in the Royal Navy. No, ship. So I would say it'd be a motor torpedo boat first. Again, as they did historically with jet engines, they did it with gas turbines. They did it in 1947. And I would say your next generation to test them out is going to be a destroyer. That lines up with the Travel class destroyers actually when they're ordered in 1936. And then if you consider when they're being built and everything's being worked out already for them, that's when you can start construction. Start planning your capital ships to have them. And in 1937, you're ordering the King George V's and you're ordering the Illustrious class aircraft carriers. I don't think the first generation jet aircraft would have been biplanes, but I do wonder if the Gloucester equivalent test aircraft would have been one. I don't think Royal Oak gets the gas turbines, mainly because actually I think some things do, but I'll get into what those are going to be soon. The first thing that's going to get them is going to be the torpedo boats. Okay, they're going to test out those first, and that's really interesting because that can mean the Royal Navy could have a class of very high-speed torpedo boat in production early on in World War prior to World War II. Very high speed. I'm talking something dogboat profile, but with the speed of a Schnellboat. So you'd be the Schnellboats class usually advantages that they can do 43.8 knots versus a dogboat. Well, the Fairmile torpedo boats, mounted torpedo boats, could do 29 knots. You get the power of these little gas turbines in them. Maybe even just pure jet engines, honestly, but you know, probably gas turbines. You could well be talking about something in the region of dog boats which can do 45 knots. Because if we consider they are powered as they are with 20,000 horsepower, you get a couple of turbines in there, and let's say they're 15,000 ones, you're at 30,000 shaft horsepower. Well, Schnellbots are fast because they have roughly that horsepower. Scary thought, guess him. You're jumping ahead of me. Wait till we get to the cruiser section and we'll be talking all about those. Dogboat with the speed of a fairy sawfish. Oh no, just go. Never will be a Glosto. Frank and support would be 30 to fix the axle flow. Rolls Royce held Frank back. It's all sorts of fun with them. The English electric camera, that flew in 1949, had a range of 5,440 kilometres and could carry 8,000 pounds bombs. Well, the Vickers Wellington can carry 4,500 bombs. Fast long-range jets would make the bomber mafia drool. This is the other point. It's going to sound strange again, but one of the other advantages for Frank in this period is if the Navy have got in and they're pushing through, you can imagine the bomber mafia are going to go... But we'll be getting onto that, because they will be going, oh, it's so long weight and powerful. We should Jet Schneider trophy-based fighter scout. We'll leave that to Supermarine, okay? We'll leave the jet. The nice way. What will Supermarine go for? And honestly, one of my videos to record that I'm scheduled for recording on to have come out on Boxing Day. Hopefully, if I've got it recorded to the point at which I'm satisfied. The reason no video turned up on Friday was I was coughing so much, it was so disjointed, I wouldn't post it. But if the videos which I'm now recording tonight and tomorrow work well before tomorrow's live, then Boxing Day you could enjoy that, because there is Supermarine jet aircraft included in that. Now, give me a second. Look at this lovely Tribal-class destroyer. Isn't she pretty? This is, of course, Haida. She is well worth a visit. She's beautiful. But I want you to imagine her. That if the weight saved on engines, meaning she only has to have, let's say, four of those gas turbines in there. Now, the weight save would probably mean that instead of having four 4.7-inch guns, as they were originally fitted with, in those mounts, which are not too dissimilar to the ones which she's fitted with now, but those are the high angle versions of the 4-inch mount. Well, the Royal Navy actually has a dual-purpose mount that's available in 1936 for a design for a destroyer to be put on 1935-36. It's just too heavy. It's too heavy, they can't make the sums work with it and have enough firepower, and it's considered not useful, necessary enough. But if you've got gas turbines, potentially that dual-purpose turret gets used. Now, what turret am I talking about? Well, it's a turret you're all kind of familiar with. It's the turret fitted to the L class. If we consider that turret, that dual-purpose turret, their choice was to either fit 3 of them or 4 of these. And honestly, when they had the tonnage released thanks to the treaty breaking down, you could build the L-class destroyer. Now the thing is, if you have gas turbines, I would say you'd still have the quadruple or maybe a quintuple. You have the torpedoes fitted as traditionally. You do have that. But you know, the single launcher system that you still have the quadruple 21-inch torpedo tubes. You might even get a quintuple actually, because they sort of have those quite soon afterwards. But quadruple torpedo tubes. But I think you'd have those 4 turrets, 4.7-inch turrets. And that changes some very interesting things on them. It would help with the save. It would help with the high angle fire against aircraft. It would help with a lot of their operations and capabilities. I think honestly, that's a very, very simple change, very basic change, but has a lot of consequences. I'd also point out that the destroyers after them, which would be the J class, would probably also have those guns and have those engines. Again, they go with 3 twins in the 4.7-inch mount, the same mount that the tribals have. But they would probably, the JK&Ns would suddenly come up with the same turrets as are fitted onto the L class. And the L's are not that long away, and then you have the O's and the P's and all that. They are all, the OMP class are the last class ordered prior to World War II. And again, I think if you have the gas turbines going through things, and if you have those turrets as a standard, you might well see the OMP class having the same guns. You might end up with a standardization of at least 3 of those twin turrets. They might have more torpedoes, they might, but the thing is, that's going to change a scenario a lot. Instead of there being this rush for 4-inch guns, they're not going to need that because they've got the high angle fire available of those turrets. Now, again, I think the tribals, especially if you're talking of 15,000 shaft horsepower engines, 4 of them, so they have 60,000 shaft horsepower, I think they are going faster. How much faster? Well, I think the official speed might go up a few knots. But you've also got the thing that you'll be able to run them on, have a single turbine running for each of them. To keep, have a single turbine for each shaft as your cruising speed. And then you turn on your second turbine to up your power. Doctor, that wasn't possibly the most concerning acoustic profile you ever adopted. Thank you. With on the under 600 ton squad, making high-speed torpedo ships with heavy armament might be a reality. I'd say the motor torpedo boats probably get us said and upped. At only $4.25 for a full day's visit. That's about £2 or £1.75. Yeah, it's literally you can buy a coffee, or you can go on a tribal class destroyer, or you can buy a coffee and have a tribal class destroyer. And honestly, let's be honest, the coffee is probably going to cost more. Now, you've also got the fact that those engines are going to cut down the number of crew you're going to need. Again, think about it. You have you have 3 watches, sets of crews, for the boiler space. You have to have 3 for the engine. You have to have them for the engineering engine space as well. And when you're talking about a Tribal class destroyer, you're talking it's got 3 boilers, 3 Admiralty 3 drum boilers, and 2 steam turbines. If you're changing it to gas turbines, that's suddenly a whole different watch scenario. You're talking maybe a drop of as many as 30 crew down. It could drop from the 190, 220 roughly in flotilla leader role to 160, 190. Wouldn't the rebuilding turbines be easier? Possibly. Honestly, rebuilding turbines is going to be a lot easier to break up and move out with less work. You can break up a turbine far more than you can break up a boiler and turbine set. A steam turbine set. And also, you have to think about it, you don't have the steam piping running around the ship. There are lots of things, complications you have to have if you consider all the water pipes, all the water storage, all the other assistant things that are stored on this ship, which you don't have to worry about if you haven't got boilers and steam turbines. Andrew Cox, we'll get on to the knock-on effects. Again, anti-air shifting their crews from the. I don't think it would happen initially. And then remember, the Tribal class come into service. They're some of the most heavily armed AA-wise ships in the world for their size. It still proves ineffective, mainly because of the assessment of the guns due to what was viable within the weight and what was considered important, therefore, from the exercises. If the turrets are viable within the weight, then I think you have even less of an issue of growth of crews during wartime. You're still going to have condensers. You're still going to have the water plants. You're still going to have water storage on the ship. Yes, for drinking water for crew and hygiene, all those things. But in nicest way, the vast quantity of water you need for the engine, the amount of water you need for personal hygiene and the crew, versus the amount you need for the steam turbines, is an order of magnitude of difference. An order of magnitude of difference. Then we have cruisers. Well, here is the thing. So, I'm going to start this in reverse order, because the Abdeel class, if they find a way to make those things faster, they will go with it. Okay? They might end up with the same turrets that are being put on board all the destroyers, especially if they've all been put on board all those destroyers, because why not? And which gives them a far more general purpose armament. B, let's consider the Abdeel class. The Royal Navy admits their top speed as being up to 40 knots lightly loaded. And this is unofficially 72,000 shaft horsepower supplied by 4 Admiralty 3 drum boilers and 2 Parsons geared steam turbines. Again, if we're going with 15,000, you could have 3 for each shaft. You could easily have 3 gas turbines for each shaft. That's gearing, you can make that work. You also might decide to put in a 3rd shaft. And you might decide to put in 2 on each shaft. I have no idea. But I think you can easily, if you're building this for speed and power, you can do that. And I think you could get this very, very powerful. And I think 90,000 shaft horsepower, good luck trying to catch it. They may officially match certain aircraft which have actually managed to go fast enough they peel their own paint off. Now, the interesting thing comes with the Edinburghs, because if Edinburgh and Belfast, if we consider when they're being ordered and built, they'd be on similar timeline as the Tribals. They would be the 2 cruisers you can most likely afford to play around with. And there comes a really interesting scenario if we consider them. If we consider those vessels and what their exact needs are, because historically they have 82,500 shaft horsepower. They have a top speed of 32.25 knots, and they have a range of roughly 5,300 nautical miles at 13 knots. They'd achieve this with 4 shafts and 4 steam turbines. And 4 boilers. So again, we start having to think, okay, you're going to want it balanced on each vessel. So you would want to have, if you're fitting on your destroyers, 2 gas turbines per shaft with gearing as your standard. Abdeals are going to come later, so you can muck around then, but if I'm doing it with the Edinburghs, I'd be fitting 8. Which means I'd be giving Belfast and Edinburgh, if they're 15,000 shaft horsepower turbines, I'd be giving them 120,000 shaft horsepower. Probably still for a lot less weight than the 4 steam turbines and 4 boilers take up. Especially once you include crew and the provisions needed for the personnel to take them and the space that takes up. So you can A, work on increasing their range, but B, does anyone want to do a rough maths in their head of what happens if you add 50% more shaft horsepower onto HMS Edinburgh or HMS Belfast? Because they go from 82,500 shaft horsepower to roughly 120,000. Now, I know technically that's only 37,500 shaft horsepower increase, but it's close enough to 40,000 for us to think it's roughly 50% power increase. Anyone will think what happens to the top speed of Belfast and Edinburgh in that scenario? You reckon gas versus steam turbines? You don't need to heat the water. You don't need the mass of all the water. You don't need the crew to operate and maintain the boilers. You don't need the energy loss. Yeah. I'm about to say I gotta go, but I've just seen HMS Belfast. So anyway, do we have a historic class with one ship having a steam plant and gas turbines? I don't know, gas turbines. What was the power differential in the designs? There isn't a class like that. It's rather a quick boom transition. A 12% increase in speed. That's roughly what I was thinking about. Which, to my mind, means they're roughly 35, 36 knots. So you've got a 36 knot HMS Belfast and HMS Edinburgh. That doesn't sound like much, but let's be honest, that's going to be a very attractive thing to the Royal Navy, isn't it? 36 knots on those ships is going to be something which is going to make them incredibly attractive. It's also going to make them incredibly critical for some of the performances in World War II. And potentially you could also get those quads in under the tonnage limitations. Although the major problem with quad 6 inches wasn't necessarily the weight, as it was the complication of getting to work. They have to completely redesign the prop to keep them disintegrating from the cavitation. Yep. Does that percentage account for lost weight? I'm fairly sure they use the weight for other things, so I don't think they lose the weight and go, we're going to keep that off and take her on slimline. I think they're going to go, what can we use that weight for? It is potential that, yes, Belfast and Edinburgh and any subsequent cruises could actually stay in service longer, because if they're gas turbines and everyone's keeping gas turbines going, then it becomes useful ships. They become useful command space. Alternatively, you might see them replaced earlier, because it's going to be an easier transition. If nothing else, they use it for armor. Yeah. That's going to change that one. So we consider the Crown Colonies is probably going to make the top weight scenario worse. But also, if you think about it, with the Crown Colonies, you are basically taking a Southampton design and trying to add in all the stuff you want onto it. Well, if you're taking a Southampton design and the first thing you're doing is changing the engines. And remember, the Southampton class only had 75,000 shaft horsepower. Only 75. The Crown Colony class historically had 72,500 shaft horsepower. So you could find yourself maybe using scaled down ones, or you could find it interesting. You could be putting two shafts have 4 turbines and two have a single turbine. I'm not sure what you do with them, but again, they have 4 boilers, 4 steam turbines historically on the Crown Colonies, and 72,500 shaft horsepower. But if you go with the same as the Edinburgh, as what the Edinburghs had in them, you could be talking about a very different ship. Now, we haven't got into how other navies react, but the first thing I'm going to say is, I would say it's going to take a while for the others to catch up. Please let me explain why. The Royal Navy has all this funding being put into them to put it into place. And they did have the funding historically in place in the Admiral Theatre. If we consider how long it takes the Senate to realise war is coming and actually fund the US Navy properly, I don't see the US Navy managing to get into this properly, although they're probably doing some work on it, but they probably won't be getting into it properly until the later 1930s. I do see them trying to push into it, and I'm fairly certain, especially if you have enough the companies like Browns, etc., involved in the UK, the information is going to be available in America not too long afterwards, but it's going to be a case of actually building it themselves. For Germany, this is would be a massive cost increase, because they'd have to start a whole new development of engineering, and you can imagine we'll be getting into that, what they might do. France, honestly, I think they just give up from the get-go. Interesting enough, Japan has real problems. Because remember, for a large chunk of the 1930s, they sacrifice their entire production capacity to building the Yamato class. Well, they do that, in this scenario, they lose out on a lot of tech development. They'd have to do a lot of spending to get up with us. Now, final class here to talk about are, of course, the Didos, which are the class I find the most annoying in history. Now, they historically have 62,000 shaft horsepower across 4 shafts, 4 steam turbines. So again, they have all that weight. And they achieve a top speed of 32.5 knots, 32.25 knots. With that, because of their size and their weight. So let's put it this way. What happens if you go with them with the same pattern I've just been talking about? The 8 turbines. The 8 15,000 shaft horsepower turbines. You might not. You might have developed new turbines and bigger, better turbines by this point, but you still might be going with the standardization of the 15,000 shaft horsepower turbines because there's enough of them, and you really know those ones and you can really trust them. Think about that, then they got from 62,000 shaft horsepower to 120,000 shaft horsepower. Think about the Didos with twice as much shaft horsepower. Now, they might still build the 5.25 guns. In honesty, the Royal Navy loves the 5.25 at some point for completely random reasons, so they probably still do. But also, there's the fact that for it to be a cruiser, it needs a bigger gun than a destroyer, is the British terminology. The Abdils get away with it because they are mine-laying cruisers and they are different. I see it just taking a while. It would be like part of the steam turbine being sold to everyone else. It takes 5-10 years for people to catch up, and Britain makes profits from selling people. Potentially, and this could be talking about the Parsons turbine again, because again, my view is if any company gets heavily involved from the naval side, it's going to be Parsons. They're going to be the first ones the Royal Navy will turn around and bring in. A Dido with double the shaft horsepower, seeing as more like an ideal class, has been. Michael, alternatively, keep historical shaft horsepower, but use the weight saved elsewhere. Armor. Well, the thing is, you could double it and still save weight. That's the thing, Michael Cooch. You could double it and you would still save weight. So think about that. You'd have extra horsepower, extra weight for armor, and you'd have double the shaft horsepower. I don't see submarines getting any changes because, honestly, turbines aren't going to help them out much. At all. Draconet, Nazis Germany would have at least 2 groups working at fighting each other funding. I suspect Göring and Himmler would be at least 2 of them. Many of them. The weird parallel development of 4.5 inch and 4.7 inch 50 and the 5.2 inch is something to make one go, and about the British procurement development. You have to remember, Dan Freeman, you've forgotten that there was also a 5-inch gun being developed on the same period timeline, and the 4-inch as well was being done on at the same time, and the 5.5-inch gun as well. So the Royal Navy was quite literally running on doing work on the 4-inch, 4.5-inch, 4.7-inch, 5-inch, 5.25-inch, and 5.5-inch gun all at the same time. I mean, honestly, if just going back and just going, pick one, would just save so much money, time, and effort. So, Andrew Cox, given the Germans were heavily into diesels, can you see them trying to push diesel even further rather than the gas turbines? They might do that. The fact is, honestly, the Germans could be completely thrown around by this because So many people, they'd be. We'll get into this in a second. Their reactions probably really most interesting. Can we get the diesel cruise submarine scenario with a gas turbine Royal Navy? I think that if you combine the two, that's probably a dangerous thing for the Germans. No. We had a very good 5-inch gun being developed. It didn't fit our weight profile requirements. So, yeah. Don't get me started on that. That's one of the joys of things of what happens if the British and the Americans decide to do joint 5-inch gun research and develop a joint gun in the late 1920s. That's a really interesting thing because the Americans will end up with you probably end up with something which is roughly the 5-inch 42, given the criteria of them both. So, here is the thing. You would be talking about the upgrades from 1936 onwards, which is not Warspite. She's done earlier. So Warspite gets the steam turbines. But here's the thing. Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, Renown could all get gas turbines. Let's think about that for a second. Now, HMS Renown is a glorious vessel. And once she's modernized and upgraded, is a very beautiful vessel. She began her construction in September 1936. So, you know, and if we consider again time like Queen Elizabeth Valiant, if we consider that the the boilers are replaced by 4 Parsons geared turbines and 8 Admiralty free drum boilers operating at 400 psi, this replacement alone saved them 2,800 tons worth of weight. Now, imagine if you're converting them to, well, the golden figure you're looking for is 120,000 shaft horsepower. 120,000 shaft horsepower. So again, 8 of those 15,000 shaft horsepower geared gas turbine sets. Oh no, let's go. Those gas turbines, that gets you there. That could save about another 1,200 tons, I'd reckon, on top of what they saved originally from the original fit. So that would be a saving of 4,000 tons. Imagine what you can do to HMS Renown if you have 4,000 tons to play with. There is also the thing of course, someone might go, we'd like to see how powerful this ship can be made, and decide to stick in 180,000 shaft horsepower. In which case, you would have a Renown which would be capable of, well, historically 112,000 shaft horsepower, going up to 120,000 after after the refit she comes out in 1939 from. If she came up with 180,000 shaft horsepower, at that point, I'm fairly certain you would be talking about a vessel which let's put it this way: 50% increase in speed, probably some region of going from the original 33 knots to, I would say, potentially as much as a 20% increase in speed over that. Let's say officially 32 knots. Let's say a 20% increase in speed. So we could be talking about a... Well, you could be talking about a 38 knot HMS Renown, but let's go simple. Let's just say 36 knot Renown. Yeah. That's just not good. Again, the thing we talked about is we talked about the King George V's. So gas turbines, I can see them getting their 12, 14-inch guns. I can see them being built with even more subdivision and armour. You think how well armoured those things are, you think how well subdivided they are, that's getting built. But also think about Vanguard. You know, HMS Vanguard... She is built to do 30 knots with 130,000 shaft horsepower. Again, it's the 4 steam turbine sets. It's the 8 Admiralty free drum boilers. Again, if you're replacing that with 4 shafts, each driven by 3 turbines, doing 15,000 shaft horsepower, or maybe 2 that have been upgraded to 20,000 shaft horsepower each. Again, not out of the realms of fantasy by this point when you're talking about how many you'd have in service. You could be talking about something which has 160 to 180,000 shaft horsepower. Again, that's going to be a boost in speed. And a boost in engineering performance. I'm not sure if... the thing is, I have this sneaking suspicion that if the gas turbines work out as well as they do, because of the sheer amount of weight they save, and the sheer amount of medications that makes life easy to do, I wouldn't be surprised if you actually see a couple more ships upgraded. Let me explain my point. Okay, if the turbine, because of the way the steam turbines come in, they're an improvement, but they're not a colossal improvement. There's a big difference between being able to do 2,800 tons of extra stuff and 4,000 tons extra stuff. If you think about with Hood, well, that would have been a very different scenario. You know, HMS Hood, she is 144,000 shaft horsepower. She's got 24 Yarrow boilers in her and 4 geared steam turbines. So again, if you have 20,000 shaft horsepower ones, great. If you have 15,000 ones, and you've got 4, you probably end up going 3 on all of them and ending up with roughly 180,000 shaft horsepower. And think about how much tonnage you could save on something like Hood. You could be talking about another 4,000, maybe even 5,000 tons differential. Overall savings once you've put in all the things of getting rid of all the boilers, no new boilers added in, and you're replacing the steam turbines as well. And steam turbines actually tend to be heavier than gas turbines. And you are not having all that piping. All sorts of things change. And subdivision can change and all sorts of things. So the thing is, I could see the Royal Navy pushing a little bit faster with their developments. So I could see maybe instead of doing almost 1 ship at a time, which is sort of what they do, them almost doing 1 ship, 2 ships, and 2 ships. And I'm not sure if Hood is one of the ones which gets upgraded, but I would be sorely tempted to say that Repulse might get upgraded, along with Renown. And I could see that maybe another of the Queen Elizabeth class gets upgraded as well. Now, the thing is, people are talking about gas, oil, logistics supply. You're talking about ship's fuel. And the fuel which can be used, there's the high aviation jet fuel, which is high aviation fuel which is used for jets, which is really high grade stuff. But the stuff which is used for ships is slightly less difficult to get hold of. Again, this is important when we're talking about the period we're starting off with, because it's almost a factor of refinement. And if you consider the Royal Navy stockpiling and refining ideas, and when it starts buying a lot of fuel, I think, again, this fits in, because they do do a lot of growth of their fuel storage in the mid to late 1930s. So again, if this is the new requirement, they're going to start storing the better fuel. Yes, it's going to cost slightly more money, but there again, if they are buying it in vast enough quantities, it's probably going to go down in price, because of the fact that more people are going to get into making it, because they want to get in on the money. Half a dozen ones, 60 hours. Paul, would you get that much increase in speed? What is the hull maximum speed? Well, that's the interesting thing. The Renown class hull is a very good, well-designed battlecruiser hull. And I've seen computer simulations of if they have enough power, doing up to 40 knots. It's not fun, but I would say 36 to 38 knots is definitely within their ken. Andrew Van Camel, why is she called Vanguard, sir? Well, you see, whenever she's always pulling away from her escorts whenever we think of opening the tabs. It would be interesting. And there's also going to be a crewing reduction, which is going to have a consequential impact on weight and the hotel load of capital ships. Again, Hood has 24 boilers that she have to be crewed and watched, along with the 4-geared steam turbines. Think of the sheer amount of space in the hull that takes up. Turbines can run on kerosene. You could also make turbines which can run on alcohol. A version of ethanol, I think. I seem to remember that someone had experimented with it. So, yes. Andrew Cox, for stationary gas turbines, you can accept lower quality fuel and just a bit bigger combustor. So I wouldn't expect the fuel quality to change really. And Dracula and multi-fueled things. I don't think Hood gets chosen before Repulse, and there's a reason for this. If you send Repulse in, you can upgrade her material level, and you can get the time service out of her. And also, remember, this is the Royal Navy is thinking about fast carrier escorts at this point. And the fact is, it's cheaper to do Repulse than it's going to be to do Hood. So I think Repulse gets done, and I think another Queen Elizabeth class gets done. I don't think Hood gets done this early on. You are right about Hood's boilers, but I just don't think that happens. General Electric has a design that runs on diesel. General Electric turbines, if you look them up, they are frankly frigging amazing, those things. Aircraft carriers. Oh, that's the interesting thing. Okay, so Here's the thing. So let's say they're ordered in 1937, as they are historically. That means you've got roughly the first generation of jet aircraft coming into service when they're being ordered. So I don't see these getting a massive change in terms of their overall design. I don't see them getting a massive change in terms of their overall design, but I want you to think about something. If you consider the illustrious class, they historically have 6 Admiralty free drum boilers, 3 shafts powered by 3 geared steam turbines, roughly 111,000 shaft horsepower. Again, you don't need those boilers, so what might you change? Well, the Royal Navy would dearly, dearly love to have 4 shafts on them. They'd also dearly, dearly love to have a lot higher hangars. And if you consider the size of boilers, etc., and the space they take up in terms of hull height, and the space they take up in terms of personnel requirements, etc., that could all mean that you could actually lower the height of that space and condense that more down in the hull and actually raise hangar height without affecting the overall height of the vessel. Have a thought about that one. Now, the interesting thing is, if they keep the 3 shaft design, they could end up having to go with... Well, they wouldn't go with 6 turbines, because that's only going to give them 90,000 shaft horsepower, which won't be enough to get to the 30.5 knots, and they want to have high speed. So they'd have to go with either possibly 3 turbines, which means they could end up with 135,000 shaft horsepower, which would be an increase of 24,000 shaft horsepower. So not as dramatic as the others. Or alternatively, they go with 4 shafts and they have 2 turbines per shaft, in which case they end up with 120,000 shaft horsepower. Either way, I don't see a massive increase in speed, but they might be 31, 32 knot vessels. The interesting thing will be, once they get into service in roughly 1939, 1940, that's when the second generation of jet aircraft will be coming into service. And so, I think what you probably see, I would see it going 2 ways. I could well see torpedo bomber aircraft, etc., going the turboprop route. I could see whatever comes along in the Albacore version being a turboprop aircraft, and the Royal Navy actually being forced to go innovative with that. And maybe it's even a sort of Barracuda-style aircraft earlier on. But I could also see something perhaps happening interesting with the Navy in terms of looking into jet aircraft and a jet fighter. I see that more likely than a jet torpedo bomber to begin with, mainly because of the way the jets are designed and the space required and operations for a torpedo. A fighter bomber, though, could be an interesting scenario to go down the route of. I think the first jet aircraft into service, the first group that come into service in, well, as said, 37-ish, would be fighter aircraft. Again, we always have to remember, one of the things that holds up the Me-262 is Hitler's insistence on it being a fighter bomber. And the British are quite prepared to go for a fighter. So I think you end up with a fighter. I'll be getting into those again, but what the point I want to make is, I think actually for this generation of aircraft carriers, the initial generation, the real differences are going to be engine power still, and what they do with that extra tonnage and that extra space. Conversely, I would say that the Implacable class might well be found to be different. I'm not sure if they would get full mirrored sight landing, full angled flight deck, but I wouldn't be surprised if you saw something coming in because of the higher landing speed of aircraft and the ability to fix them. They'd start off by trying to operate with increased strength, catapults, and other systems. Now, we did talk a second ago about steam generation, and using steam boilers for steam generation for the catapults. And, well, that's the interesting thing to get into. Because... how do I put this politely? The first catapults, well... steam catapults come into service for heavier aircraft in the 1950s. The first catapults, and the ones we're talking about often into war era, are interesting. They're mostly hydraulic. Some are explosive charges, but most of them we're talking about in this period are hydraulic. So the really interesting thing is, at this point, it isn't going to have an impact. The British aren't going to worry about steam for the catapults because they don't have steam catapults. The interesting thing is going to be what comes as aircraft become heavier. Okay? As aircraft become heavier and bigger, how are they going to react? Because traditionally they have a source of steam, which is what they go to. They go to the steam turbine, the boilers, and they have this steam. They have this power. And steam and high pressure steam drives a lot of things on a ship. So they're probably going to have to start looking into electrics. And that's really kind of interesting because you see, if they're relying on electrical power generation rather than steam power generation, there's all sorts of different things they might have to do. And we might end up with actually electromagnetic launch systems in the 50s, 60s. There's a potential for that. 262 was also held up by engines. I do agree. It was held up to an extent by engines, but it was also held up by Adolf being a bit of a twonker. We'll get into that in a bit. And you can have a small boiler dedicated to steam for catapults, but it's not going to be a factor in the illustrious class. It's not going to be a factor in any class built in this period. Alright, HMS. Wait, hang on. The ship with the highest hangars in the Royal Navy is HMS Unicorn. Yes. Unicorn does have the highest hangars of any. Ark Royal's the next highest, and then it comes the illustrious class. In terms of the new builds. Can we speculate on what the strike group looks like? We'll be getting into that in a second. I'm going to first talk through the ships, and then I'm going to get into the aircraft. I'm not getting into tanks because I don't think we end up with jet power, with gas turbine or jet powered tanks at this point. No, people here aren't twonkers, but young Mr. Adolf was definitely a twonker of the First Order. I would say a twonker of the first, second, and third orders myself because he's such a large twonker, but we'll leave that to one side. And it all becomes an interesting thing. With the amount of mass you're saving, where are you going to put that mass? if you're the Royal Navy in this period, you're probably going to put it into hangar size and survivability. Because again, the main if you think about the Royal Navy of the illustrious class, they would have liked more aircraft aboard them, and they'd have liked more hangar space. But they have limits due to top weight and due to the whole requirements of the overall weight requirements, and trying to fit 6 carriers into their total cumulative tonnage allowance. Well, if they're saving themselves 2,500 tons, well, let's say 2,000 tons, what are they going to spend that 2,000 tons on? They're going to spend it on hangar space, and they're going to spend it on sort of the air group size, which is hangar space. So the reality is you're probably looking at an illustrious class which has the capacity for, well, starts off the war with an air group of 48 to 60 aircraft rather than 36. I doubt you see emails in the 56. Too big of a material science challenge. Having improved hydraulic launchers is probably more likely. I would agree with you, but I would point this out. You're talking about in the middle of the Cold War, at the beginning of the Cold War, where there are a lot of egos at stake. I would say there would be a lot of people involved in pushing that, and they don't realise how big a materials challenge it's going to be until they get into it. I don't think you get railguns, but emails are a very different thing than railguns in terms of the wear and tear on materials. But any jet aircraft will be a bit larger. A bit larger, yes, but I still think that's why I'm saying 48 is my suspicion. But again, as I've said, I don't think you have necessarily got jet aircraft going straight into all the aircraft carriers' roles. And I have a reason for that. It's going to take time to take it in. If we consider how it was historically, the other people with jet aircraft, what's the Royal Navy fighting Korean War with? Turboprop. They're fighting with very fast contra-rotating propellers, turboprops, all those things. That's what they're using. And they're still... Why? Because they make sense for carrier aircraft. They make sense for some of the requirements carriers have, especially with jet engines when they come in. So I can see that being really interesting stuff. I can see the first generation being fighters, but I can see also the RAF being very focused on their bomb production. Colin Cameron. So in this scenario, half the USSN carrier officers die of jealousy when they meet USS Robinson. Potentially. They possibly look and go, oh, sweet mother of Lord. And you have a bar? You have alcohol, armor, and bar? You have alcohol and armor? You have alcohol. You have armor. Tell me, is it true that the Royal Navy love you? The Royal Navy really care for their pilots? They give you alcohol and armor. What kind of benevolent angel service is this to serve with? We don't get paid as much as you. Who cares? You get subsidized alcohol. Sorry, I'm remembering the conversation I had with a US Marine who, after he'd returned from service aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth recently, the poor man was sitting there going he never wanted to go back to another US Navy ship as long as he lived. He said it had ruined him for all other nerves. Oh, he was actually crying at the thought of being posted to a US Navy vessel. Honestly, gas turbines tend to be easier to maintain and easier to overhaul, but the first generation of doing them are going to be more interesting because they're going to not be used to it. Once they're used to it, yeah. Trading ice cream for alcohol is US Navy tradition, yes. Look, it's interesting. You know, there was I had a discussion, and the Christmas episode of Bilge Pumps comes out tomorrow. By the way, I was having a discussion about we were having a discussion about this before Bilge Pumps, and all three of us have stories from people who we know who were part of the US Marine Squadron, who were deployed on Queen Elizabeth, etc., who basically have said that they honestly at several points were considering transferring to Britain to the Royal Navy because of the accoutrements, and they still get to fly the F-35. They still get the cool aircraft. They just they get far better service, and apparently also the beds were more comfortable as well. At least according to one source, the beds on the British ships were a lot more comfortable than the American ones. So, which leads us into aviation. Now, historically, the first ever landing of a jet aircraft on a ship was a de Havilland Vampire. And the thing is, I could see a lot of aircraft like the Vampire ending up in the mission of World War II. Honestly, Vampire, Venom, those aircraft types seem to me very like the early jets the British would end up having. So you want to look at them if you want your model of what your aircraft might be in service. And the Vampire and the Venom both end up being carrier aircraft. Changed into Navy terms. Interesting enough, neither are particularly massive. This was Winkle Brown landing, by the way. Yes. So things could be pretty interesting, and I do agree the Vampire is incredibly cute, but I also don't think necessarily members of the other nations would agree with you, because if we consider some simple stats, if the British are working up and building up their Shadow Factory program, etc., and are concentrating in, let's say they concentrate in on the Vampire rather than the Supermarine Spitfire. Let's say it's a Vampire type aircraft. That's possible. If you've got a Vampire-like aircraft coming into service at the same time instead of the Spitfire, that's a bit of an increase over a Spitfire. And the thing is, again, we're talking industrial capacity. For much of World War II, Britain produces more aircraft every year than the Germans do. Britain produces far more in terms of heavy aircraft than the Germans do. It's a very good aircraft, is the Vampire. And, well, you'd still have the radar being developed and radar control. And the thing about the Vampire is, if we look up at the de Havilland Vampire, and if you want to go look its stats up, you're more than welcome to. This is the trouble with having a whole load of notes loaded up. The different ones, the wrong ones keep coming up. Its original first flight was September 1943. It entered service in 1946. But its first flight was 1943. So again, saying that you're pushing forward and you're having an aircraft like this come into service in probably the second generation, in roughly 1939, 1940, I do not consider to be an outlandish thing to think about. And as broad stats go for it, it has a de Havilland Goblin 3 centrifugal flow turbojet engine with 3,350 pounds of thrust. That's 14.9 kilonewtons, giving a top speed of 548 miles per hour, a range of 1,200 miles or 1,000 nautical miles, a service ceiling of 42,800 feet, a rate of climb of roughly 24 meters of, well, let's say 4,800 feet per minute, which when I divide by 60, which is my want to do, because frankly I find it when they list it as 4,800 feet per minute I find absurd, and they didn't give it meters per second. In the book stacks I've copied out here from the book about de Havilland, 4,800 divided by 60 by my count, I will admit, is 80. So yeah, is 80 feet per second. Makes rough sense. Armed with 4 20mm cannon. I'm not sure they still have the 20mm cannon. They might still have the pathetic machine guns, but they could have the 20mm Hispano cannon that was being looked at the time. Ability to carry 8 3-inch rockets, or 2 500-pound bombs, or 2 drop tanks. That seems like a fairly capable aircraft for me. Now the thing is, yes, you would have to build slightly better runways. And please note, I am saying slightly better runways because, believe it or not, the joys of this aircraft are that it is not exactly the most how do I put this? It does not require exactly the best quality runway in the world to run from. In fact, a basic concrete runway will do. Fairly easy to repair and maintain. I would add as well, about the Vampire and quite a lot of these aircraft, that you probably have to look at it slightly differently, because with their speed and their range for interceptions, you could actually also base them slightly further back. So whilst their air bases, to actually attack their air bases might be more difficult, because you might actually keep them slightly further back. You might be able to keep those air bases slightly further north, and still actually intercept. So Ed, you're quite right when you talk about, you know, they would need sort of slightly better things, but compared to a Spitfire, they're fairly decent, and you could do things with that. The thing is, I would say, if we're talking about an invasion of France, the reality was it was the French army collapsing because of its communications and internal issues caused by the French politicians that caused the fall of France. Not necessarily the air war or anything like that. So, yeah. And my gooch, as I've said, I have this feeling the Royal Navy ends up with a load of turbojet aircraft. I'm not sure if they actually get any jet fight aircraft in this generation. That's something you might even have more like a June the Big Wing given the high closure speeds. That's true. Again, it's, there are different things you can do with it. I think it could have a very interesting effect on a lot of things. I also wonder how much effort you would put into Crete, etc. So the Gloucester Meteor's original first flight was also March in 1943. That ended service on 27th July 1944. My view is that something like this, could have been in service with the Royal Air Force from about 1937 onwards. Maybe 1936 onwards. Again, the thing that's going to change things. That's going to change the development of things dramatically. We all talk about. I always try and talk about how you are intercepting different views and how different people react to it, and how it's then you have the reactions to 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 the action, and how it's very difficult to predict onwards of those. So there is a reason I'm being very careful about what I'm not saying, because there are some things you honestly cannot predict. And if this is what the Royal Air Force's fighter looks like in 1937, if their latest fighter looks like this, then that's going to have a big impact on the rest of the world. Let's be honest, if the Royal Air Force gets the first jet fighters into service, and they're in service in 1937, that's going to make a lot of people evaluate things. I'm not saying it's going to hold off on World War II, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does buy Britain some more time to rearm, which actually makes it more dangerous for anyone to take on Britain in this scenario, because their industrial might comes into play far more and they're getting longer to build up. The Luftwaffe, etc., are going to be suffering because they're still building up from pretty much the same industrial base. They've got the same problems to face as they do historically, and there isn't much that can overcome that. The advantages they have at the beginning of the war are often the sheer amount of the fact that they've been preparing for war almost on a perpetual basis, and they've already got there. Whereas the Allies were mostly thinking war was going to be hoping war was going to be slightly longer away and started preparations later. Well, in this scenario, the British might still not be preparing for war any quicker than they have historically been, but they've got a huge tech advantage. I think the second power to have jet aircraft would... Well, my sneaking suspicion, it's probably Germany that might be the second power to have it because they're putting in effort. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's a race between Germany and the USA to see who's second to get it. So F1 Meteor comes and serves at the same time as the 109C. Pretty much. Which... something similar to the Meteor. Please note, I'm saying this is something similar to the Meteor. One of the things you have to think about is that while they're testing and developing aircraft, they're going to find the sound barrier and having to deal with the sound barrier. So that's going to be part of it. Now, there is the interesting fact from the Mosquito, but a lot of things change historically. A lot of things change historically. I would not be surprised if you have. Well, I'll be getting into the likely response of the various powers in a bit, but the thing is, if you've got these aircraft combining with fighter direction radar, you're seriously going to have the bomber mafia in the UK going a bit absolutely crazy. Again, the thing is, if you consider the British will have already stolen quite a big advantage in... the problem for people is going to be this. If you make the tonnage requirements tighter to try and impact the British, they've already got the advantages of developing the gas turbines and the jet engines to get the most out of the power to weight ratio they've got. If you start making the tonnage try to raise the tonnage limits so you can more easily match them and build effective ships, that's going to be basically giving them the effect of free tonnage. And the trouble is actually getting air power conferences going. They tried several times in these war years and they failed regularly. It's far more difficult to get them through the naval conferences because it was far more difficult to find aircraft. Far more difficult to define aircraft. And that leads us to the bombers. Now, this is actually the most interesting because theoretically, this is 8 years away. Okay, they start the. If we consider they originally start funding in 1939, this is 10 years away. So we start funding in 1928. Theoretically, you could be talking about a Canberra or something equivalent entering service in 1938. My scenario, I would say it's going to be more like 1943. I would think, historically. Maybe earlier. I think the jet bombers are coming. And they might well be tacked into the second generation of aircraft. They might be the ones they might come into service roughly 1940. But I'm reckoning 40 to 43. You have some form of bomber aircraft coming in. And you have to remember the Canberra does look to an extent like a scaled up Meteor. And I wouldn't be surprised if the first bombers do look again like a scaled up Meteor. As for V-bomber force, etc., that's generations away, and I don't know whether that's the next generation after this or if it's a completely different thing. The reality is, any scenario where you have this pushed and you still have that Griffiths Whittle debate going on, and the important thing I've got that's really changed things is I've added in to make it work is the involvement of the Royal Navy's, the Admiralty coming in and introducing in the marine engineering companies, i.e. Parsons. Once you've got those companies, those sort of engineers involved, you're going to see a dramatic change. You're going to see a lot more metallurgy and a lot more work on it. Because again, one of the things you have to think about is the differences in terms of the scale and materials they procure and what they're talking about. I also think myself that if you end up with aircraft like this coming into service between 1940 and 1943, Especially you have jet fighters defending the UK against piston aircraft. I wouldn't be surprised. Interesting enough, I think you're still likely to see maybe something like the Hawker Hurricane. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a turboprop powered Hawker Hurricane or something similar to that in service alongside a jet fighter. I would not be surprised at seeing an overlap as an insurance. Okay? I would not be surprised at seeing turboprop something like a Vickers Wellington turbopropped aircraft. But I also wouldn't be surprised if instead of a Lancaster, something like this comes into service. And Whittle will be far more cooperative because, again, he'd not be suffering like he did, but also, honestly, knowing the Navy, how do they deal with Parsons? How do they deal with Parsons? Think about it. How did the Royal Navy, how did the Admiralty deal with Algernon Parsons? They funded him. They got impressed by him, and they basically funded his development, made sure they bought directly from him. Now, if Parsons are building gas turbines, the Royal Navy probably just set up so that they pay for every gas turbine they build, they give Whittle and Jet Power Company some money. In which case, Whittle's going to be happy with it. Whittle's going to be completely fine with it. I've just realised Barnes Wallis is a plane designer before he goes into bombs in the late 1930s. Barnes Wallis jet bombers are terrifying thoughts. Maybe you'd have a turboprop Lancaster. Maybe, but I think probably you'd be talking about the jet bombers. Nathan, do you like Azur Lane? I've never watched it. Never seen it. I hear it's a very good method of getting people into naval history though, so I like it. But I've never looked at it personally. Now, this is another interesting thing because it's one of the areas I didn't get into specifically, but I did actually start to consider, is that helicopter anti-submarine warfare could actually be in place by World War II. Now, the thing is, that can change things dramatically. But my first thoughts were that what you'd do is you get a modified sloop with guns forward and a helicopter hangar flight deck aft. And what you might end up with is, instead of an escort carrier program, to an extent, you'd have sloops with helicopters on them. But the thing is, you could end up on that scenario with the ASW helicopters also being used to try to intercept the Focke-Wulf Condors. And I did think about that for a second and then thought, surely that wouldn't work. And then I was looking at some of the aircraft and some of the flights and thought, well, if the Condor's coming in low enough to identify the ships and identify the convoy, it might be low enough that such a helicopter could actually trounce on it. Ed Sutherland, dipping sonar. You are both right and missing something on this one. Because the thing about dipping sonar, if we consider in terms of development, there are lots of dipping sonar systems in service in the 1930s, late 1930s, early 1940s. And those dipping sonars, though, are different. They're not helicopter deployed ones, of course. They're ones which are used on trawlers and things like that for a lot of research work, especially marine research work. That's what they're doing. They're sort of hydrophone systems, mainly. Oh, on lines. So the thing is, again, I think you would probably find a dipping sonar made for such an anti-submarine warfare aircraft. It wouldn't be as we would describe. It wouldn't be as capable as a modern dipping sonar by any stretch of the imagination, but it would be something. And also, you have to remember again, when you're talking about submarines of this period, you're basically talking about submersibles, not submarines. In that they are supposed to spend quite a lot of most of their time at sea on the surface. If you force them below the water, you slow them down. Most German submarines can manage to maintain 7 knots underwater, and then they're going to get through their battery power very quickly. So if you've got them underwater, if you force them to go submerged to avoid the helicopter, etc., you've got a chance to blast past them before they can get out and get up and do damage to you. Blackburn Maximus, the Western Whirling could carry set depth charges, and it was powered by 700 horsepower piston engine. A turbo shaft could be much more powerful, similar size. Yep. Right, it's one of those things. Even the Soviet Union had people poking at jet engines prior to 1959. Yeah, it did. There are lots of people poking at them, and it wasn't. We're not talking about something which is beyond the realms of power to develop at the time. Helicopters small unguided AA rocket pods with their loiter capability will be a problem with Commodore, and we have found a use for the unrotated projectile launch suddenly. Good lord. That's true. That is true. Now, naval aircraft. Well, here is a Hawker Seahawk, and of course a de Havilland Sea Vampire. And basically specialized versus converted aircraft. I have a feeling the first jet aircraft the Royal Navy gets will be converted. Excuse me, I'm just going to blow my nose outside. I think that's coming. That was a success. I think you could probably end up with. My view is you'd end up for helicopters. You'd end up with sloops, and you'd end up with some auxiliary carriers. Before you ended up with mass conversions of ships to it. Take care, everyone. But I think, yeah, I don't think you get specialised naval jet aircraft in time for World War II. I think you might get some converted aircraft, but I think the actual aircraft you'd have operating from carriers would probably be turboprop aircraft. I think that's what we'll be looking at. Which is still going to be a very useful aircraft type. Let's be honest. If you've got those coming into service, they are very reliable. You're not going to have the problems that the Taurus had initially with the Taurus engine initially had with the Albacore with those. So you end up with a scenario which probably gives you a very reliable successor to the Swordfish. Probably a very decent, reliable fighter, which is good loiter time and slightly higher speed. And also, think about this: if you have turboprop engines being the engines of choice for the Navy, and jet engines being the engine of choice for the aircraft, for the Air Force, you might not end up with all the fights you have over engine parts and engines between the two services. Kind of like how the Air Ministry was happy to ignore all of Bristol's supplies because of their engine type, because the radial engine wasn't what they were really interested in. They were interested in the piston, in the sort of inline engines. So if the Royal Navy's taking the turboprop engines, the Air Ministry is less likely to cause them trouble. And, well, that gives the Royal Navy some advantages. It's going to give them, as said, bigger carriers. You're talking bigger air groups than they had historically. Much bigger and more capable air groups than they had historically. You're talking about a 48 aircraft capacity air group without deck parking on an Illustrious class carrier. That's going to be a big change if you've got them available. If the Battle of Britain is a complete walkover for the Royal Air Force, and you don't have the bombing getting through that you did historically because the jet aircraft are able to intercept the German attacking aircraft far more quickly and far more easily over the North Sea, then you end up with far less disruption to construction by bombing. You might well see more autogyrotypes as well. I'm never quite sure. The autogyrotypes were more of a thing which was favoured by the Americans and the Germans than the British. So in British case, I think it'd be more of a case of sort of those sort of scenarios. I don't necessarily think the Swordfish survives in service as long as it did historically. I think if you have a good turboprop successor coming into service in 1939, 1940, I think the Swordfish might well be replaced by that. I think if it's the kind of thing, if you have a decent turboprop, long-range, reliable aircraft, that might well take the role of Swordfish over. So, effects on World War II. Well, it all starts with the two mustachioed gentlemen. Or rather, the mustachioed one and the bald lip one. Balding bald lip one. What can I say about these two? Well, I think you would see Italian industry ordered to try and match and develop a jet aircraft, in which case that's going to be a further strain on their limited infrastructure industry as they're trying to improve. I think it's also going to make them all slightly more wary about war, because the British have had jet aircraft in service from 1937. I don't think anyone else matches them before getting their own first generation into service probably about 1938-39, because of the time it would take to develop them and implement them. At which point, I think the British are, of course, getting their second generation to service. And let's be honest, the second generation is usually a lot more reliable and a lot better than the first generation. So, I have this sneaking suspicion. Sneaking suspicion World War II, whilst it probably still takes place, might not take place in 1939. The reason being, if you've got that much infrastructure industry focused on trying to match in, and you're that shocked by the British, you're in trouble. Now, this for me means you might end up with the King George V's, at least King George V and Prince of Wales, potentially illustrious, victorious, and formidable as well, getting into service before war begins. I could see you getting that second generation of aircraft into service. And I would say if you have a British jet bomber, then the first thing that happens should war break out is a jet bomber is going to do a high-speed run and drop a whole load of pamphlets on Berlin, just to show that we can reach there. I think Japan is also in a bit of a quandary, because suddenly you have a far bigger problem. There is going to be a growing gap between Britain and them. America can catch up. America, if their government actually starts giving them the funds, can catch up quite quickly. They are building up their infrastructure, they have their industry. But the trouble is, if the British have got the tech jump with their infrastructure and industry, they can get ahead a lot more quickly than others can. So America can catch up and surpass the British. Yes, I'm not saying they can't. But for the other powers, the British get this jump and are getting a couple of generations ahead. It's going to cause a scramble. And I think that is going to affect confidence of certain people in terms of... Let's be honest, it's very difficult for Göring to turn around to Hitler and go, the Luftwaffe will win, when the British have got jet aircraft and they haven't in service. He probably will turn around and go, we can't win at the moment. We cannot win, mein Führer, because of their having this jet aircraft. We must develop jet aircraft. You must give me money and more power to the office of the 5-year plan, so we can match them with jet aircraft. We can have better aircraft, and all that going on. So while they try and push on to that, I think that will cause an interesting delay. I also think if you have gas turbine powered ships for the British, I wouldn't be surprised if both of these gentlemen are trying to push for it for their own fleet. Which is again going to cause some trouble, because if the British are already trying to buy up all the rare materials that they can to supply their own demands, that's going to cause more of a trouble of them getting hold of it. Because remember, what they're running short of is a lot of currency to buy, foreign currency to buy these things. That's the whole reason for the Germans pushing for autarky, because they don't have enough foreign currency reserves to actually be able to buy a lot of the stuff they want to buy abroad. Basically, I think war gets pushed. I think war doesn't happen much later than it does happen. I would say, though, we're talking late 1940, early 1941. I would agree with Ed Sutherland that if the Royal Navy had got control of the Fleet Air Arm earlier than they did historically, if it's not the 1937 Inskip Award, if it happens earlier, then they probably get jets more quickly. But I don't see the Inskip Award changing because of this. In fact, I see the Air Force fighting tooth and nail, trying to fight harder, which could actually get them into more trouble with the Inskip Award, because of seeing the Royal Navy as a threat to their getting jet aircraft if the Royal Navy have complete control of the Fleet Air Arm. So I think it happens as it did historically. 9684. I wouldn't use that phraseology because my little cousins are watching, but I wouldn't disagree with it. the UK. It's not the UK government that's the investor in the autogyros. It's it's certain individuals in the UK who are investing into them, in the stereotypes, and yeah, that's different. It's Let's put it this way: there are reasons for it. There are some really weird politics going on with autogyros, and whilst I agree, there's a lot of individuals investing in them. That's not really the There's a reason the government's not getting involved in them. It's all sort of weird internal politics in the air ministry, and frankly, I'm not the one you really want to talk about this. You want to talk to somebody who's a specialist in the air ministry. I have a friend who I'm trying to get to do a video for this channel. I would love to do a video with them talking about the air ministry, internal politics of the air ministry, with them about it, but they're just worried they'll end up getting stoned by people, because what they're going to say is basically almost sacrilegious for an air power historian to say, probably. Go on, Cameron. If more German pilots are being shot down over the North Sea, can Luftwaffe even support Barbarossa, given their low production and training numbers at the time? That becomes a problem. As Blackman Maxwell says, if Germany's getting dominated by Allied air forces, would they even need Barbarossa? I'm not sure there would be. Lions could be a reality, and how fast could they hit with turbines? Well, that's the other interesting thing, because of course, the more time you give the British, the more they're going to be building on with what they're building. So the further along a lot of those projects are going to be. How do those two clowns do so much damage? Mostly constant drowsiness. That is a question of mostly because the rest of the world had not been prepared. Because a lot of people have believed in a peace dividend. One of the constants of history is that humans have hope, have joy in their hearts, and want to believe in there being a peace dividend. They want to believe in the war to end all wars. They want to believe that the world has reached a point of maturity where wars are not going to happen. And the trouble is, humanity sucks. My cousins have heard me use that phrase quite often, so I'm not worried about saying it in front of them. But humanity sucks. Okay? This is my point. Some people, when they talk to me, they say, you're a warmonger, you're all sorts of things because I advocate for defence spending. And I sit there and go, I'm really not. I just know disarmament has never stopped a war. I know, the most peaceful period in human history, the most peaceful period in human history, and that's a scary thing when you think about it, when you look at it, when you actually look at it, the most peaceful period in human history was the Cold War, where two sides were threatening to blow the earth to smithereens multiple times over. That was the most peaceful time in human history. There were wars going on all over the place, and it's still more peaceful than any other period of human frigging history. Yet people tell me disarmament will bring about peace. Andrew Hooks, the Italians were actually developing their own version of jet, but not as good, and jet-powered N1 flew before the 28th, before the 39. The thing is, I don't see them getting much on quickly, again, because of their infrastructure limitations. John Quigley, think when US airlines see the development of jets progress in the UK, they will really push US industry to match and exceed us. They will try to, certainly. I think there's a... I don't see the... civilian jet airliners in Britain, I'm not sure if they come about before 1940-ish. So, it might not have an effect before the beginning of World War II, but it might have an effect on World War II. One of the things you have to remember about the Royal Navy is there's all this idea that there was less of an emphasis on aircraft carriers, But then if you look at it, the longest serving Third Sea Lord, Henderson, who's in charge from 1933 onwards, it was the first rear admiral aircraft carriers, and in 1930s. And prior to that, the officers responsible for the aircraft carriers were the vice admirals of the battlecruiser squadrons. And if you look at their positions and where they go on to, they all get quite senior, and some of them become first SEALs, etc. So honestly, there is, once you start looking at, whilst yes, you can find in all the plethora of Royal Navy admirals some really interesting opinions about naval aviation. When you look at the senior officers who are actually in charge of things, and actually the people who are designing and procuring the fleet for the future, they're all quite pro-aircraft carrier, but they just recognise that aircraft have not yet reached the level at which they need to for them to be the replacement of the capital ship. That's one of the factors you have to think about. It's a case of, it's when do aircraft become reliable enough that they can sink in all weather, and that's an important thing, in all weather, including night, because night is for operations considered a form of weather. In all weathers, reliably sink enemy shipping, including capital ships. And that's a period which happens in World War II. So, as aviation-minded as the Royal Navy was in the 1920s and 30s, remember they had the most aircraft carriers of any nation in the world, the most tonnage of aircraft carriers of any nation in the world in the 20s and 30s. They were not. It was not a case of we can replace all our capital ships with carriers tomorrow. Clarke, do we see the bombing crew in the UK pushing a B-37 equivalent for sheer bomb capacity? I'm not sure. It could be interesting. Hey Clarke, German turns up in jet-powered airline 1938. Just to remind Herr Hitler who wears the trousers. More than likely, knowing Chamberlain, he's a tech-obsessed. He's a tech aficionado. If he could find a jet airline, and Britain will probably have some airliners just for that purpose. It is a shame, Ed Sutherland. I do agree on the autogyro. Bad Mass, the 956 could do a lot better for British. Could be dominating the airline industry and not having so much a destruction of the country. I think the rule of peace has always been a mix of Churchill and Teddy Roosevelt. Georgia is better than World War, but have forces to back it up. Like Roosevelt says, talk softly and carry a big stick. Yes, that's exactly it. You can talk incredibly softly and be incredibly friendly when you have a big enough stick behind you. Because people can see the stick. You don't have to brand it, push the stick in their face and go, see my stick? See my stick? That's what people with small sticks do. Small stick energy shoves the stick in your face. Big stick energy has the stick just leaning there and goes, so, how do you feel today? And that's the point. It's the confidence nations have, and it's the sort of the ability to actually influence events. Still a problem, mental fatigue. Oh yeah, you have that issues, but you know, it's like anything with history. You'd work through those things. When they come up, they work through them. It's interesting about the jet airliners or jet seaplanes. It could be jet seaplanes. There is a real thing in me that I think the Sunderland flying boats might be jet-powered aircraft, the short Sunderland flying boats, because their first flight is in 1937. They introduced the service in 1939, so they might end up being jet-powered. And I just think that would be colossally cool. If you can imagine a Sunderland with 4 jet engines. I don't think so, Scooters, GP. That you have to remember he's done a lot to re-establish national pride. And remember, a lot of them didn't think war was going to be coming. They believed he had calculated right. I'm not sure about the V1 being developed in the war. I'm not quite sure if they'd be the same. Not quite sure what they'd be like, so I've not really said. But I'd reckon they'd be 4th or 5th generation of aircraft. So I think turboprop will be best option. Yeah, I know, but I still like the idea of jet pads on land. A big small stick energy needs to be shirt merchandise for you. It could be fun. Now, so what's the summary? Well, I love the swordfish, as you all know. I haven't done a video about it. I did a video about the fairy albacore, and as I said, I've got a video coming up about the submarine scimitar, the last of the submarine aircraft. And I'm probably going to record that this evening before I head in, so it's done and ready for Boxing Day. And then I'll record Christmas Day's video again tomorrow morning, and probably Wednesday's video as well tomorrow, before we have the live tomorrow evening. Because if I can get them done, then they are done, and then I can take Monday to Wednesday off for family events. Summary. Andrew Cox, I'm not sure if you see this as a contradiction, but sometimes you say Hitler and Mussolini wouldn't go for war in 1959, but at the same time you see it, except they didn't see it coming. The thing is, Mussolini definitely didn't see it coming because Hitler promised it wasn't coming. Hitler calculated it wasn't coming because he believed that the Allies weren't investing in defence. The thing is, if he sees the Allies investing in jet technology, he would probably think they're more, especially the British investing in more, he would probably think that they were slightly better prepared for war, so he would be more calculating on when his own preparations for war would be complete. So the thing is, it's one of those chicken and egg scenarios, in that I see that because Britain would be doing all these things with jet technology because it'd be cool and because it'd be useful and it'd be really showing our strength in a really good way for us to economically deter conflict. And remember, Britain has a history of liking to go for technological means to deter conflict. HMS Warrior, HMS Dreadnought, all these things are good examples of British pursuing tech as a way of deterrence, tech advantage as a way of deterrence. I could see that to me would force back Hitler's own preparations and own readiness for conflict. So I think that's what gives you roughly a year to 18 months more before war begins. But that's my scenario. I think he makes the same calculations. I just think it's further along that he does it. If that makes sense. I'm not sure the British give meteors to the Republican side in Spain. They might give them a turboprop aircraft, but I don't think they trust them because, don't take this the wrong way, the British were always worried about what they supplied to the Spanish because they thought it would go to end up in hands of the Soviets. So the British were not keen on supplying much to the Spanish, to the Republicans. They supported them. They were happy to support them, to fundraise them for them, and to help them in that, and in all those sorts of ways, to wink at people going to fight for them. But they didn't want to give them tech. Let's see. Andrew Cooks, I'm not sure jets would have made sense for long-range aircraft until second or third generation. Just historically, the long-range jets don't appear till the 1950s. But you see, the second generation would be 1940. So that's the point. Because then if you're looking in the interwar period, you're talking about a 3-year generation, especially development of aircraft. So your second generation of aircraft would be 1940. Your third generation could be 1943. That's what I'm talking about, Andrew Cox, because you're talking about wartime accelerations. Submarine did have some Delta Wing aircraft, and they were looking at, but they didn't actually get aircraft getting into service. The last one they get is the Scimitar. And then they sold the jet engines to the Soviets, and they used them to make their own, and the MiG-15 was born. Yeah, the MiG-15, and its jet engine was always so reliable, wasn't it? So reliable. I mean, that's one thing the MiG-15 was really known about for, its reliability of its engine. Because YouTube sometimes does that. The consolidated PBY flight, the first flight, is only 1 year different from the Fairey Swordfish. Yep. 1930s produced some really beautiful aircraft. And there's such a pace of aircraft development in its time. It's really interesting once you get into it. And as said, my theory is that in this scenario, we've coupled together the metallurgical science capabilities of the big marine engineering turbine companies with the mass production desires of the aero engineering companies and the Whittle genius, tempered by the Griffiths debate, and that's where you get it all. Sean Shea, I don't know if that was sarcasm or not for the MiG-15. Apologies to the answer. How does this influence the USSR? Oh, I think Stalin grows even more paranoid. Honestly, the only thing I can see is having this tech jump by Britain, considering the traditional Soviet and Russian view of Britain as perfidious Albion. Absolutely. Basically, if you're ever asking the Russians who's the mastermind behind all their problems in the world, it's usually Britain. The fact is, for some reason, the British are the most evil. The British are turned, if you listen to Russian propaganda, are the most evil controlling pad and manipulates American public opinion, everyone's public opinion, to be anti-Russia. Or they are the most stupid and incompetent of foes. We are always one or the other. The fact that those are mutually exclusive doesn't seem to matter to their propaganda people. That's what they tend to go with. So, if Britain has a jet engine aircraft in service, first flown in 1933-34, in service 1937, and first generation service 1937, second generation coming in, well, let's say 36, 37, second generation coming in 39-40, I think the Soviet Union is having a merry old panic attack. So, Clarke, if the Iron's not using many steam turbines for their ships, turbine sloops? Perhaps, but also perhaps gas turbine sloops. Think about it. Again, you don't have to put boilers in them. Think about it from this perspective. If you don't have to build steam boilers, you just build the turbines. Think of all the plant space, all the factory, all the machinists, all the really good engineers and mechanics who build those machines, who build those boilers, who could be building turbines instead, just turning out gas turbines. Think about that from an efficiency perspective. H100 Cox. Literally, Klumlov once insisted the VK1 was not a complete copy of the Neen. The nameplate was different. Stephen McKeown's The Autobiography. Mm-hmm. Well, Poland can blame Britain for a century of non-existence since you did the whole Waterloo party event for Napoleon. To be fair, Napoleon was annoying enough that we were happy to sacrifice Poland for it. As long as we didn't have to sacrifice ourselves for it. That was Napoleon. He was just annoying. What is the preferred use or new online bookstore for the UK? I hate to say this, but A-Books and a few others are good, but honestly, a lot of my books end up coming through Amazon. Usually, they come from people selling through Amazon. What I find, there are a lot of the bookstores which stock the specialist books for me, and that I tend to buy and have to buy and find. They have an Amazon marketplace, and that's their methodology of getting out there. Sometimes they have eBay, in which case I'm happy to use their eBay, but often they have Amazon marketplaces. Sean quickly, we might get to see a serious run of turboprop PBYs soon. A company here is announcing they are making them soon. Ooh, good lord. Turboprop PBYs. That could be interesting. Seemed like, well, I always thought about diesel electric tubes using the motors from the T-Class. Well, that's an interesting option. That is an option to go for. Excellent. The counter argument is that with far more emphasis on gas turbines for jets. Remember, the jets are getting jets and jet engines and the marine engines. So basically what you would have is you'd have Parsons and companies like that producing gas turbines, and you'd have Rolls-Royce, Napier, Bristol maybe even producing jets. And even Gloucester produced some jets, and Gloucester and de Havilland produced some jets. So you'd have the aero companies producing the aero engines, and the marine companies producing the marine engines, and the jet power company with, of course, doing a large amount of development research, getting a lot of funds in return, because every time one of them is built, they get some money. Night Home Productions. Not sure how long you're going on for, so I'll leave this here now. Merry Christmas. Thank you. Thank you, Night Home Productions. I will be going on for a little bit longer, and then I'm going to go off and record a video on the Supermarine Scimitar. And then tomorrow night, I'm going to be live doing Brew Ships Before Christmas. So, yay. And there's also going to be Bill Trumps out tomorrow. An early jet engine switch over to the UK does leave a big question for Japan as well. The tech gap is a major problem for them given the time frame. What happens in East Asia and their motives? Yeah. In the nicest way, for Japan, it creates a nightmare. Creates an absolute nightmare. Because the aircraft they're likely to be facing in 1941 over Singapore, etc., are likely to be a lot better. They're going to need even more in the way of radar control and radar coordination. But there's also the factor that if you consider the likely viability of turboprop aircraft for Fleet Air Arm aircraft in terms of that, even if you have those out in the Far East, that's going to be interesting. But the thing is, all this will have boosted the British aircraft carriers' capability. If war has been held off in Europe till end of 1940, let's say, you could well have had the illustrious class in service for longer. The more carriers you've had in service for longer, the more secure the British were probably doing. And that it's very unlikely Courageous and Glorious were caught out like they were. You might still have them caught out like they were, but you possibly don't. Especially not if they have helicopters and if they have the corvettes in service. So all those things become interesting. Right, I'm just going to scratch my nose a bit. Sorry. I could feel something just about leaking down to up here, and I didn't want to gross you all out, so I thought I'd clear it out the way quickly. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. Combined diesel and gas is quite a possible way to go, especially if you have those powering an electric system. That's probably going to happen. I will do a video at some point on blimps. Glad to hear that, Verdun. Family comes first. Take care, Andrew Cox. The horse transporting supplies like winter horseshoes. It was interesting, the whole supply issues for the Germans. It was interesting. But no, overall, it leads to a whole different range of events, because as I said, it's going to have a big impact on ship design, just from the weight, power to weight ratio reality, but also from the point of view of survivability, because again, think about all that engine space you don't need. You need to cover. Let's put it this way: you're covering less space, so you could cover it with thicker and stronger armor. So you could fit if let's say if you've got to cover half the space that you would traditionally have with the armor you put over your engines, instead of having 3 inches of armor over a wide area, you might go for 6 inches of armor over that other thing. And that's going to have, again, consequential effect on their survivability and their ability to withstand bombs and hits and impacts. So, and you also could have these things could be tacked further into the hull, so they might be less likely to get hit by a torpedo or damaged by a mine. All this is going to have an impact on the fleet and the fleet's ability and performance in World War II. In contrast, on aircraft terminologies, that's going to have an impact as well. And I said, why would you want it feeding for an electric drivetrain instead of a direct gearbox? Because that can give you a lot of power for other things as well. You could have it directly linked into a drivetrain. You could have a diesel and gas turbine linked into the same gearbox, but that can also have effects on your top speed. Anyway, thank you very much everyone for watching. Nine Productions. How much of an advantage do you think Britain would have over other nations post-war with jets being developed in the 1930s? Do we maintain lead, or does the playing field level up by 1950s? I think it's an Anglo-American lead by the 1950s. I'm nice this way. I don't see America staying behind for long. I see their Senate mucking it up at multiple points on the way, but British politicians will probably do their best to muck it up as well on the way. So, in the nicest way, that's going to even out. I think you probably have some issues in terms of, I think maybe Britain's reputation for engineering does have a significant boost. And we never touched on gas turbine locomotives because, again, that's an entirely different realm of operations. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. As I said, I hope you enjoyed. I normally will go through saying thank you to everyone, but honestly, it is now 20 past 11 at night. Someone's letting off fireworks. And as I said, I want to record the Supermarine Scimitar video before I go to bed. And I've been up a long time today already. And I've got a couple more videos to record tomorrow because I want to make sure, well, ideally, ideally, I'd like to go into next week with all the videos for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday recorded beforehand. So I just need to worry about Thursday's live and the Saturday video next week. So next week I can pretty much take it off and spend it with my family. And do the chauffeuring and all the other stuff I need to do for them. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Carl Gasberg. Thank you, Interest Done. Thank you, Colin Cameron. Thank you, Stafford. Thank you, Nightham Productions. Thank you, RG. Thank you, Albazaski. Thank you, Melanie6040. Thank you, Steve Clarke. Thank you, Ed Sutherland, especially for all the questions, Ed Sutherland. It's been really nice having you here. Really nice contributions tonight. Thank you, Bijon. Thank you, DGB40. Thank you, John Shea. Thank you, Night6831, as always, again. Lots of contributions from you. And thank you, Paul Amos. Thank you, Melanie6040 and Andrew Cox. And Darius Radatsky and Drakenred and all the others who've made really cool contributions tonight. It's been a great pleasure having a chat with you. Duke of Petrington, Blackburn Maximus, of course, for suggesting the topic. Dan Freeman, Melanie Stafford, all of you need thanks for doing your lovely usual work, along with Seneca Nero, of adminning the chat and making sure I don't have to worry about anything going on in there. And thank you very much, everyone. Take care and good night. Toodles.